This webinar will be recorded for on-demand learning at a later date. So as I said, Dr. Swetland has no relevant financial relationships, to restate for the recording. And without further ado, I will introduce our presenter for today. David Swetland is an assistant professor of pediatrics at Tulane University. He completed his residency at LSU Pediatrics at Children's Hospital of New Orleans and completed his pulmonary medicine fellowship at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He is the medical director for the ventilator-assisted care program at CH-NOLA and the pediatric program associate director for the Cystic Fibrosis Center at Tulane. I will now pass over control to begin the presentation.
There we go. Couldn't find the unmute button. So, hi everyone. I am David Swetland. I am pediatric pulmonologist here at Children's Hospital through Tulane, as the introduction said. So currently in Mettering, one of our telehealth rooms, nice and empty behind us. But today I'll be talking about vaping and epidemic that we had right before the pandemic. Actually in late 2019 on vaping-associated lung injury of VOLI being the term that we use for that. Let me know, I'll start in just a second, but any issues, anything wrong with the screen, go ahead and jump in. Otherwise, I'll start talking.
Everything looks good.
Perfect. All right, so we'll start with the objectives. So the three things we want to focus on, kind of what caused this epidemic, this VOLI epidemic, how the public health apparatus, the national public health, and then the local public health response to it, and how we treated it as physicians. We'll talk with risks with vaping and e-cigarette usage, not just related to VOLI itself, but current status of vaping and what our patients may be doing. And then regarding VOLI, kind of talking specifically about the cases themselves. So as we said, I have no financial disclosures. And so vaping is a term that we use that really covers a lot of things. You know, probably the most wide-reaching terminology is an electronic nicotine delivery system, or ENDS. That consists of vapes, vaporizers, vape pens, hookah pens, e-cigarettes, e-cigars, e-pipes. I'm probably missing a lot. Even kind of knowing about some of this information, there were still so many new things, new types of vapes, changes in just the past few years, as whether it be regulations or just new styles come in that really make this a confusing thing and really hard to keep on track of. So first we'll go through kind of what an e-cigarette is, the components of it, the history of e-cigarettes, and then we'll start talking about patients specifically. So these devices, they consist of a mouthpiece, a battery, a tank, which usually will contain a liquid or a juice that is atomized using a heating component. So electricity, either manually or automatically through the motion of inhalation, is delivered to a heating component. That e-liquid is heated. It's evaporated, and then it's then condensed into a fine mist. And then that fine mist is what is inhaled into the lungs. What's in that liquid, that tank, in some devices is going to be user dependent, and some it'll be built into the system. Historically, the first patent for e-cigarettes was back in 1930. A man named Joseph Robinson patented this electric vaporizer. It's unclear if there was ever any movement or even desire to patent it to make it a thing, or if it was just somebody putting out patents for putting out patent purposes. The next time it came around was in about 1965, was the second type of patent in the US market for a smokeless non-tobacco cigarette by a man named Herbert Gilbert. He did have a plan to patent it. He did want to try and turn this into a device that was used. And he never really had much of a ground. Nobody really took them up on it. No company was willing to try to create a device like this or really, say that there's a market for it. And so the patent was made and nothing ever really came out of it. The first smokeless cigarette hit the market in about 1985. It was kind of designed through the early 80s, maybe even the late 1979 might have been some of the early devices of this favor, the smoke-free cigarette that was created by a group called Advanced Tobacco Products based out of Texas. It's a little bit different from the other e-cigarettes and from what we see today in that there was no heat to this vape. It was simply a nicotine vapor that was inhaled straight out of the device itself. No heating, no changes in it. It did not, while it hit the market in a few spots, some test marketing, it never came out of anything that I believe people were not a fan of it. And so it just went by the wayside. And then finally, we get to the types of devices that we're in today. So in about 2003 was when the first patent came out for it by a pharmacist in China, Han Lick, who created it. And then whether, a company called Golden Dragon Holdings was the first to actually create this device and use this device and sell this device. And this is kind of the type that we see today, the kind with a little bit of a tank, the battery, the heating component, and the atomizer to it. Throughout this whole time, kind of the big American tobacco companies have really been keeping an eye on it. So that smokeless cigarette in the 80s was a device that was the Advanced Tobacco Products, not one of the big names that you hear, but they are a part of big tobacco here in the US. And so they've always kept their eye on it, but they've never really jumped on it. And so right in about 2012, the tobacco companies in the United States really started buying up a lot of these smaller device makers and trying to implement it themselves into their products. So we'll go through all these different types of vape styles. Like I said, they're very different, and even just things have changed even from 2019 when Navali was an epidemic. Really different types of vapes, different types of styles, different regulatory laws have been put out, and that really has changed the market. So this is probably what you think of with a vape. So you have a vape pen or a box kit. So the box kit is the one up top. You have a large battery in a box shape, and then you have the tank and the heating element above it. Vape pens are very similar in terms of design, that kind of straightforward design, but just more elongated, more in terms of a pen shape. So this is more of a research-based, stereotypical base. And then this is kind of what's in the market these days, these types of box vapes and vape pens as well. So they're still very prevalent. There's still things that are available in the US, unfortunately. Cigarette-like design is kind of the next style that really, I want to say, took over. They all kind of came out around the same time. But some of the big US tobacco firms created more devices like this, more cigarette look-like designs. So the one on the left is one of the early types of vapes that was produced for the US market. And the right side is actually more of a newer company, really a company that's been around for the past 2 or 3 years, the Elf Bar, that we'll talk about later. So they're still being made, they're still being designed, whether or not that's legally or not. And then starting in kind of mid 2015 or so, 2016 through about 2019, 2020 is when we started to get this bar design or pod design. And so the big difference with these is this disposable pod base here. Do a laser pointer instead. Here, that you connected into this bar that looks like a USB thumb drive. And it really took the adolescent stage by storm. It was a really mass market product that a lot of people use. There were lots of different flavors. As you can see, banana ice right here, lush ice, a lot of different mint flavors. And that's really what drove a lot of and is driving currently the pediatric usage of these products are these kind of flavors. Juul as a company, as a US company, actually voluntarily stopped selling their flavors in 2019 and just went to tobacco, menthol, and mint. and then later was outright actually banned by the FDA, but that was in 2022. So the Juuls kind of started to become popular in maybe 2016 or so. The EVALI outbreak was in fall 2019, and then the actual movement by the government was in 2022. So there's a little bit of a delay between what's happening in the real world and then some of the regulatory responses to it. The next type, which these are the types that you've probably seen. You may not know that this term, this disposable design, is called an ELF bar, but it's the most popular brand. I've definitely seen them more as litter on the side of the streets than I've seen them in patients. And talking with a resident today, he said that, you know, teenagers will leave the hospital and they'll find these left over in their patients' beds. So it is a major issue. These are really the types of vapes that most people, but children and adolescents are using these days. And again, they have a lot of flavors. They're designed to look hip, and are marketed as such in reality. And so these things, they became big not just because of flavors, but because they really skirted through some of the regulations. There really was a caveat the last time that there was a major push against flavored vapes was, oh, you can do it if it's a disposable vape. And so then they just shifted to make these types of vapes. And so you have the tank in them. It's a non-replaceable tank. They last about 5,000 puffs at this point. And so there's a lot of nicotine in these products. And then right now I can hear everyone groaning at the sight of these two vapes all across the state. So these are some stealth designs. And so while they're certainly not as popular as things like the ELF bars, the disposable vapes, these things still exist. So you have this one on the left called Puff It that looks like an MDI inhaler, that looks like an albuterol inhaler. You have this one on the right that is designed to look like an Apple Watch and also has a time, you know, shows time on it. You actually pop off the head, and the LCD screen, and that whole device is a vape itself with a band around it. There are types that are can be fed through a hoodie drawstring, and the little mouthpiece is in the hoodie drawstring while the vape itself is somewhere in a pocket within there. So again, things that are very stealthy for these types of vapes. So again, the most popular vapes really 2016, 2017 through about 2019 was the Juul on the left. And then more recently, you have the ELF bar, the disposable design. This is really the most recent transition we're in. This is what patients or pediatric patients may be using. The change from these, so on this image, you have a single pod of a Juul. So a disposable pod, you change it out. So you keep the same device, but the pod changes versus these much larger devices that have the tank built into them. So the capacity of e-liquid has increased by about 500%. This is across vapes across the board, but really the main driving factor is the difference between the Juul type pod-based vapes and the disposable vapes. Nicotine strength per puff has increased by almost 300%. The price per unit, so the price of buying one pod, you know, which again is smaller compared to buying a whole disposable vape, has increased. So you think that's going to be great, but unfortunately, per milliliter of the e-fluid has decreased significantly during this time. So you're getting a little bit more expensive of this disposable vape, but at the same time, you're getting a lot more for a cheaper price. So what's in this liquid? What is in these devices? So the devices that disposable devices, those are mostly going to be nicotine based. It's going to be more the tank based that have cannabinoids, THC in them, and those are not really sold across the market, but they are available online through less than reputable retailers, to put it that way. So THC is definitely available, and that'll come up when we talk about EVALI shortly. The nicotine-based devices, the nicotine liquids, will contain either a vegetable glycerin and a propylene glycol. So those are two additives that are generally regarded as safe for food by the FDA. That is for food. That is through the GI tract, not for aerosolization, not for inhaling into the lungs. They are what causes the vapor, that exhalation of vapor. That's what kids are exhaling. That's what people are exhaling. The propylene glycol also causes kind of the mouthfeel of a little bit of a burn, a little bit of an edge that mimics smoking and heat. These two products themselves, they can affect the alignment of surfactant within the lungs. They can affect the surface tension and limit the alveoli from remaining open. THC-based devices contain vitamin E acetate, MCT oil, terpenes, triethyl citrate. They need different additives than the propylene glycol and the vegetable glycerin because of the viscosity of the different devices, of the different materials. So the THC is going to be a thicker material, so you need these thicker additives to add to it compared to the nicotine-based ones. Flavorings. Flavoring chemicals can be added in. There's about at least 16,000 of them. So a very, very large number of flavor additives that have been added to these devices over time. And so it's really hard to know exactly what's going into these devices from that aspect. And then the byproducts as well. So not just what goes into it, vegetable glycerin, propylene glycol, vitamin E acetate, but what happens when these things are heated and broken down and in a liquid or going through the device itself. Are there things like heavy metals that may be in there, volatile organic compounds that may be in there? Those have all been seen and studied in different studies of trying to figure out what exactly is in this liquid. And so one of the big things is nicotine. This is what a lot of is what is available across the market, able to get at any store, and it is addictive. Nicotine is addictive. One of the things that people have said about vapes is that, well, it's not as bad as smoking, and for the most part that's true, but there is not zero harm to it. And nicotine is the biggest issue. And as we talked about, per puff there is more and more and more nicotine in each of these devices. So withdrawal symptoms include irritability, anxiety, nausea. You can have depressed mood and tremors. And you can have some of those symptoms, depressed mood, irritability, not in withdrawal symptoms. It can affect brain development in our teenagers, in really any of our patients. Brain development isn't going to stop until they're in their 20s, until they're really sending them to an adult physician. It can damage blood vessels, just like the nicotine in cigarette smoking does. And feelings of depression and anxiety as well are some major effects from nicotine. So while in the past, less nicotine, less other additives than cigarette smoking, as we talked about, that's not so much true anymore. One of those disposable vapes has more nicotine than an entire carton of cigarettes. So how does vaping affect the airway? There's many different types, kind of try to get a good image for everyone to take a look at, but it affects airway physiology. It affects cytokines, it affects cellular metabolism as well. It can affect gas exchange, it can cause edema. It can affect your surfactant, as we talked about earlier. There's a wide variation in what is getting into the lungs, and that is due to battery power. How strong is the battery? How hot is the device? How much nicotine is in the device? Again, something that I'm hammering home. A puff of these vapes can be more than an entire cigarette. And then the term puff topography as well. So people who smoke, they have a very stereotypical pattern of the inhalation and the exhalation. The smoke doesn't stay in the lungs for very long. That's very different with vaping. The smoke is a deeper inhalation, it's a longer hold, and that's just the baseline vaping technique, not just people who are, say, doing tricks with the vapor that they exhale. That is going to be generally a longer inhalation, a longer breath hold as well. And so not just what's going in, but what are the effects of these materials, this nicotine, staying in the lungs for a much longer period of time than what we know about with cigarette smoking. It has been shown to directly cause increased coughing and wheezing, and as well, it has been associated with asthma exacerbations for people who already have airway inflammation and airway hyperreactivity. So it can affect the lungs in many different ways on a day-to-day basis, but we'll shift over to this EVALI, this e-cigarette vaping use associated lung injury, this epidemic that we had in 2019. So what it was a rapid onset pulmonary illness. First cases were reported in about 2019, but looking back, maybe as early as April of 2019, we're starting to see some signs of EVALI, but nothing like what we started to see in August, September, October. So the amount of cases peaked around September 2019. The total numbers looking back of hospitalized and reported deaths, and this is not just in pediatrics, but in all patients, was about 2,807 hospitalized and 68 recorded deaths. With that being said, there were people who were not hospitalized, who were seen in an outpatient clinic, who were just treated from an outpatient basis. So this is not the total numbers of who was affected by EVALI, but who had severe enough symptoms to be admitted for that. Most patients, it was associated with THC containing products, but about 20% of patients reported using only nicotine products during their vaping that led up to this. So that was a question: was there a cross-contamination with THC? Were there other concerns with some of the oils that were used, some of the additives that were used? People were trying to figure this out as fast as they can. So quickly, the CDC really took a strong arm to try and define the cases, define management, and try to stop what was causing this epidemic. So they quickly came out with a case definition after discussing with the first few hotspots, the first areas that it started. Wisconsin and the Midwest was one of the first few areas where we started to see these cases pop up, but then it did eventually spread to all 50 states and DC as well during this time. So a confirmed case was you had to use vape anytime within the past 90 days. That was one of the big criteria. On imaging, you would see ground glass opacities on CT or any sort of infiltrate on imaging, or on plain films. Most of these people would wind up getting a CT at some point. You would need to have a confirmed case, an absence of an infection. And so a lot of times, there was a very wide differential, wide amount of testing, wide amount of imaging during the first few months of this epidemic. But then as time went on and people became more familiar, publications were coming out about confirmed cases and other cases, we were able to kind of walk back some of the testing. So, initially on, we really had to rule out cardiac conditions. We had to rule out rheumatologic conditions. We had to rule out neoplastic conditions. In terms of the infections, antigens, we would really look at things like HIV, strep pneumo, Legionella. All of those were alternative diagnosis, mycoplasma as well, a big thing that can cause very similar findings on CT. So you needed no alternative diagnosis. It did not include the type of e-liquid. So in terms of vaping within the past 90 days, it did not matter if it was THC or nicotine based. Confirmed case or probable case was, for all intents and purposes, really about the same thing in terms of management and numbers of saying this was a case of EVALI. So very similar criteria. Really, the only difference is really you didn't do all of the testing, or maybe a viral culture or PCR was positive. Maybe you did come back with influenza, but everything else was screaming, yeah, this was a vaping injury. So you just happen to have the flu. As we're seeing that all right now, so many kids happen to have COVID in addition to any other illnesses. If we're looking, we're testing, viral panels are going to be positive sometimes, even when we aren't expecting it. So that would then be considered a probable case. So what was going on with these patients? What were we seeing? So a pretty rapid onset of illness, and it kind of by rapid onset, it would be either that day or, yeah, symptoms were pretty bad, but they've been going on this whole time. So it wasn't that it was building up, but, well, I'm okay, I'm not that bad. You would have shortness of breath, chest pain, hemoptysis was another big one. A lot of GI symptoms, fevers, chills, fatigue, weight loss, another big one. Labs were pretty non-specific. Maybe had some elevated white blood cells, had some elevated inflammatory markers, but nothing else really pointing towards any sort of infection or any sort of process going on. Imaging. Imaging actually did kind of wind up becoming a very consistent pattern, and that's really where this diagnosis was able to be helped, was based or able to be made based on imaging. After we had enough imaging, after we were able to say that, yeah, this is what we're seeing as an epidemic during these 6 months or so. So ground glass opacities, sometimes lower lobe predominant, but not uncommon to see them diffuse in all areas of the lung. There are areas of parenchymal sparing, so there will be little areas that were not affected within the lung. The most severe are the types of patients who were intubated or were on ECMO or who died, which showed diffuse alveolar damage as well. There were a lot of other alternative diagnoses. As radiologists do, they say it may look like organizing pneumonia or diffuse alveolar damage. Can't rule out hypersensitivity pneumonitis. Can't rule out this. Can't rule out that. And so a lot of times, these central lobular nodules were another common finding, in about 20%, I believe, was the number, looking like that while having these ground glass opacities. So a picture is worth the 41 words that are on this slide. So looking at some images of CT. So this is, each of these is a different case. So none of these are repeated or none of these are changes over time. But you can see everything from very mild cases of EVALI to much more severe cases right here. You can see some of the sparing. You can see that it's not affecting every area of the lung equally. Even in these bad cases, you're still having a lot of sparing. You can have a lot of these central lobular nodules around here. And yeah, so it was a very characteristic imaging, very nasty imaging as well. That's my non-radiologist read. So what was going on in the lungs? What was this answer? What could we see? Where was this inflammation coming from? Again, nothing specific. At the end of the day, we just weren't able to get anything that wasn't just a non-specific finding of inflammation. There was no slam dunk anywhere. The BAL fluid often included neutrophilic inflammation. You would also have these lipid-laden macrophages, the macrophages that would be stained with oil red O. So you'd have the lipids within the macrophages visible under the microscope, as well as the neutrophils that we would say we saw the white, elevated white blood cell count on the CBC, but also we would see elevated neutrophils within the lungs. Biopsies, when those were done, if those were done, showed organizing pneumonia. Foamy macrophage is another name for sometimes for lipid-laden macrophages, and fibrosis exudate as well. So as time went on, as people became more comfortable with this diagnosis and seeing these patients, some of this testing went away. So biopsies, very far between, few and far between. I think maybe only 30 to 35 of them were completed, maybe across the board. By the beginning of EVALI, pulmonologists wanted to do as many BALs as possible, try and see what's going on. Because yeah, we see that CT, we need to know what's going on. By the end of it, bronchoscopies weren't even performed. You'd see that imaging and you'd say, this is EVALI, let's treat. The end. Don't need any more testing, don't need to confirm everything. It's really fitting the pattern. And that treatment was just supportive care. Any sort of respiratory care, anything from room air at home to supplemental oxygen, all the way to ECMO. All of these were managed and utilized for these patients. Steroids were used pretty frequently, probably about upwards of 90% of patients received pretty large doses of corticosteroids for EVALI. Question is, was that actually needed? Were steroids the right answer? My vote is yes. I would still treat anything that looked like this with steroids, any sort of vaping injury with steroids. But in people who didn't receive steroids, people who were treated at home, there was a pretty rapid improvement over time. So was it people without steroids were doing very well very quickly. A lot of these patients received antibiotics more so early on than later in the epidemic. So again, just really throwing on antibiotics, keeping them on, not wanting to take them off until we get this negative testing, but then you would have already completed a full treatment course by the time that came on. So most of these patients received antibiotics, even if at the end of the day, looking back, we know that there wasn't any sort of infection. Trying to get the kids to stop vaping, most importantly. There were absolutely reports of somebody leaving the hospital, of many people, not just one person, leaving the hospital, continuing to vape, and then immediately returning within 1 to 2 days with recurrent symptoms. And then long-term as well, beginning of the epidemic, being admitted, being in the ICU, going home, continuing to vape, 2 months later, 3 months later, coming back in, even after symptoms had already improved. Over time, things really got better. We talked about things getting better over a pretty rapid period of time, but symptoms, imaging, repeat CTs, lung function, FEV1 really improved, all at about the same speed. Again, going back to very non-specific answers for all of this, PFT evaluations, spirometry, just showing a mixed bag across the board. Some people would have obstructive patterns, some people would have restrictive patterns, some people would have diffusion patterns. All across the board, if there's a limitation, most of these people would be improving over time. So how? Why? What caused this? That's the biggest question. Several things were thought up first. Was it the additives? Was it the vitamin E acetate? Was it the flavorings? Was there a specific flavoring? Was there something else in there? Was it bacterial contamination, for example? And so really the first big group, or I guess kind of more the definitive answer, came from evaluating BAL fluid. And so this started as a CDC evaluation, and then the definitive answer, so they kind of had a hint, they had a suggestion based on less patients than these 51 patients, kind of the first 20 patients on this. But then at the end of the EVALI epidemic, we were able to kind of confirm what the answer is. That will come soon. And so we got to the answer by looking at 51 patients total. So 25 confirmed cases, 26 probable cases. So the difference of a full workup or not. There was also a comparison of 99 patients who did not have EVALI, some of them who smoke, some of them who were non-smokers. Of the smokers, about 18 of them were otherwise vape users as well. So in this sample, most of these patients, about 94%, used THC-based vapes. 77% of that same group of 50 said that they use it, but 94% did come back with positive THC metabolites. A lot of people as well, about 64% came back with nicotine metabolites as well. So there was a lot of dual usage in those who do utilize THC-based vapes. And then this is where we got our answer. So again, much better in a chart form than just one line on a slide. So looking at it, across the board, in cases with EVALI, 94% had positive vitamin E acetate in their BAL fluid. Two other positive findings that were found in other cases: coconut oil and limonene, which is in citrus fruit peels, but is also a diluent that can be used as well, were found. 0 of any of these materials were found in the non-users, the vape users who did not have EVALI, or in any cigarette smokers as well. So really this big flag, this is how we're able to determine that vitamin E acetate that was added into THC-based vapes was the cause of EVALI. So vitamin E acetate, commonly used as the dietary supplement, commonly used as vitamin E, as well as in topical creams, facial lotions, specifically. So tocopherols, they can affect surfactant, especially when heated. They can transition into a liquid crystalline, and then that will affect surfactant and surface tension directly. As well as when it's heated, it can be cleaved into catine, which is a lung irritant that we know of. So again, not just what is in these pods, but what happens when it's heated and inhaled is another question. Also supporting the consideration that vitamin E acetate was the cause of this, in terms of products that were seized, looking at products that were seized. In 2018, before the epidemic, all of the liquids that were seized by law enforcement in Minnesota were negative for vitamin E acetate. During the middle of this epidemic, every e-liquid was positive for vitamin E acetate during that time. So it was on the list of things that we're thinking it might be. It was clearly added in around the time that this epidemic took hold. And we found it in BAL fluid. And sure enough, you know, it wasn't in terms of this substance was being added into the vapes. It wasn't a hidden thing. Trade reports of people making these e-liquid juice were saying, hey, this works. This helps in the THC. It works as an additive. It is the same viscosity as THC oil. And therefore, it mixes well and can be used within the vaping pods. And starting in late 2018, and then really in early 2019, it was added more and more into more widespread pods. And so it was, again, used. They said, all right, this is something we recently added into these liquids recently, and we see the result of that. And really over time, you know, so the cases really peaked in the August 2018 or 2019, excuse me. But by February 2020, so not quite when COVID hit, the cases were pretty minimal. And so the CDC handed off all reporting, all mandatory reporting and evaluation back to the states, to the state departments of health to continue seeing it. So those numbers went down, the epidemic was over, there was a looming pandemic that obviously took most of the CDC's focus away from keeping an eye on this. So it's done, right? Well, what about just vaping in general? So the first case report of something with e-cigarette usage was in 2012, actually. So they report 7 months of dyspnea, coughing, fevers, lot of crazy paving, ground glass opacities on the CT that was reported. Their final diagnosis was a lipoid pneumonia because of these positive lipid-laden macrophages in the lungs. And they said it must be from the e-cigarettes, it must be from this lipid that is inhaled. So between 10 years, 2012, 2022, before EVALI was even a thing, there were case reports across the board. And these were the final diagnoses of those case reports: the lipoid pneumonia, organizing pneumonia, diffuse alveolar hemorrhage, hypersensitivity pneumonitis, which we talked about can be very similar with imaging, ARDS. Not all of these would actually meet the CDC criteria to become a case of EVALI. And in fact, the presentation in most of these cases were very diverse. They looked back and said, were these all EVALI? Was it that obvious? And they actually kind of came back to no. They came back to, yeah, these were all vaping injuries, but this wasn't necessarily something like a vitamin E acetate induced vaping injury. But again, you have very similar symptoms from that. So as we talked about, State Departments in 2012, at the ATS, American Thoracic Society conference, pediatric subcommittee talked about it. They were saying, and I was one of them, not at the ATS, but I saw patients throughout 2021 who did have vaping injuries still, who did still meet the criteria for EVALI. So while the numbers really dropped to almost nothing in early 2020, cases were still occurring through 2021. And so, yeah, are we still going to see potential vaping injuries? Yes, I think so. We saw it before Ebola. We'll see it after Ebola as well. So I think it is still something to be concerned about. These things aren't safe. It wasn't just an additive. There's still a lot of things that are very pro-inflammatory that are in these vapes. So where are we now? What is happening with vaping? What is happening with usage, and what is happening with laws? That'll be kind of the rest of this talk, to focus on that. And so are we going to continue to see vaping injuries that might not be a volley, but could there be a new epidemic from this that comes out, a new additive that causes damage? Perhaps. So for, like many things, kind of tobacco survey, the National Youth Tobacco Survey done by the CDC is what really helps us gauge numbers within children, both cigarette smoking, but also e-cigarette use. So the 2023 data, which is what we're going to talk about for the most part, was collected from March to June 2023. You have two subsets within that: middle school students and high school students. About 7.7% of all students in the survey reported current use of e-cigarette, so used an e-cigarette within the past 30 days. 10% of high school students, so they subdivided between middle school students and high school students. So 10% of students are vaping or vaped within the past 30 days. 90%, almost 90% vaped with flavoring. So they used a vape that had flavoring, that wasn't nicotine only. The order of those: most common one, fruit flavored, candy flavored, sweets flavored, desserts flavored. Those were one category. Mint flavored, and then menthol flavored as well. Nearly 40% of vape users, e-cigarette users, are 25 or younger. Of those who use, so of the 7.7%, the 2.1 million children who vape, about 25% of them vape daily, on a daily basis as well. E-cigarettes are the most popular product for 10 years now for patients, much more than cigarette smoking, cigar smoking. That number, cigarette smoking, is down, way down, continues to be down. That really started in 90s, early 2000s. It has been a steady decline since then. The different brands that are mentioned, the Elf bars, the Esco bars, those are both disposable vapes, kind of the most common ones. Juul is still on there, despite really not being a thing anymore. The FDA had an enforcement against them in mid-2022, and like I said, they stopped doing the flavoring, selling the flavoring in 2019. That doesn't mean there aren't alternative pods that can be used within that device. Again, disposables take up about 60% of patients, or 60% of people, of children who vape, are using the disposable type. The first real push, the first real FDA enforcement of sending out, not just sending out letters, but closing down and blocking importation of these devices, was in June 2023. They've done kind of small things here and there, but really the first major push that they did was a little bit after the end of the survey, including banning the Elf bars specifically as a brand. So over time, so what's happening with vaping over time? You can see right here. So this is the overall usage graph of current usage. We really had a peak right before the Ebola outbreak. So the 2019 survey would have been done in the first half of 2019, where Ebola was the second half of 2019. So you can see that usage dropped. There were some bans. There were some state bans in the short term during the Ebola period. All of them had, end dates. So it wasn't just these things are banned, but we don't know what's going on. There is a medical, a epidemic. We're going to do a 3-month ban. We're going to do a 2-month ban. So Washington, Michigan, Oregon, and Massachusetts implemented bans in the short term. Mostly just partial bans, mostly just bans against flavored vapes. And so there was a little bit of both. There was a little bit of EVALI scared kids. It was a pretty significant issue. They might not know somebody who died, but a lot of people had harm and had symptoms of EVALI. And that, I think, is seen in the short term, right after, in the next year. Looking back, looking at the 2021-2022 data, there was a change in methodology. So with COVID, they switched to an online survey from an in-person survey. And so there is a caveat that these numbers right here can't be compared to the previous numbers. But 2022, that number was almost 10% of middle and high schoolers total. Like I said, that 7.7% right here, added in little bubble, added in little dot. So we've had a little bit of a decrease over the past year or so. And then as well, since then, we've also had things like a ban against some of the disposable vapes. So as a whole, one of the main discussions about using things like a vape is that it's it's healthier to cigarette use. Also, you can use it to stop smoking. Use it as a bridge to stop smoking. A lot of people who do that continue to vape, and that's in the adult range. So that's really been evaluated in the adult range. If you use it as a method of cessation, probably not the worst thing. There is still harm, absolutely, but yeah, there's absolutely less harm than a cigarette. But also stopping and cessation being the right endpoint. So why do teenagers use it? Why do adolescents use it? And so there was a study in 2022 looking back at the 2020 National Youth Tobacco data set. So the reason most adolescents use vapes is because of curiosity. They're just interested in it. Peer pressure, peer influence. That's another reason. It's everywhere. People see it. People see the disposable vapes. They didn't kind of specify what was the other topic. They use them to do tricks. So a quarter of the people who vape or in this survey said that they do them to do tricks. That hasn't been shown anywhere else, but also hasn't been asked anywhere else. And so doing tricks is something that's popular on social media. But I think they were surprised to see that and know that it was a thing that was that widespread. And then flavor as well. 20% of patients or of adolescents say they vape because of the flavor. In terms of using it as a bridge to cessation, that's much lower in pediatrics, about 6.9%. So in pediatrics, that number of people who are smoking or smoking cigarettes or smoking cigars is very low and continues to go down. And so using it as a bridge to cessation isn't really a valid reason for adolescent vaping for most people. That's not why people are vaping, why adolescents are vaping. In the same survey, the highest odds of intention to quit were those who were curious, and quit attempts, and actually quitting were those who were curious. So those who didn't develop it, things like flavor or peer influence, those who maybe tried it once or twice or tried it for a few months and then stopped just because they were curious but never really enjoyed it. Those are the people who we can help to quit and who will quit with that help. In terms of does vaping lead to cigarette usage, that's actually tough to say. There's some clear correlation between vaping exposure and uptake of smoking. That has been found in studies. There is a little bit of pushback to those numbers, and really the thing that's doing that is there has been a rapid decrease in cigarette and cigar usage by adolescents. And that number is actually dropping more since 2014, since vapes really hit a thing. And so it's kind of not that they haven't found a cause or a correlation between that, but that does affect the number. So I think those who are a little skeptical of vaping leading to smoking is saying, well, you can't use this data to say that. Not so much that it's not happening, but the trend is that less people are smoking. So is it vaping, or is it just the trend that we've been seeing beforehand? One last thing, the rise of vaping has far exceeded tobacco use. That's kind of the big endpoint, regardless of whether or not it is something. Vaping is still increasing. Like I said, there have been studies that showed a direct 4-fold increase in smoking for those who vape beforehand. So federal regulations, what's happening? How is the US government managing this? How are they able to do anything about any of this? So the FDA has kind of had more and more authority put onto them in terms of nicotine products, tobacco products. So in 2009, FDA gained authority over cigarette and other tobacco products. In 2016, the deeming rule transitioned not just tobacco and cigars, but also any sort of tobacco product, anything that comes from tobacco, which would be the nicotine in e-cigarettes. And so this also had every part of that as well. So not only do they manage the liquid, the e-juice that has the nicotine in it, but they manage the products themselves. So the bar or the disposable vape, they'll look at the battery itself. They'll have authority over the mouthpiece. They'll have authority over the entire device, top to bottom, if it's being used for this tobacco product. The original quote was that it's a tobacco product. And so that was deemed a natural tobacco product. So nicotine that comes from tobacco. And so one of the ways that laws were skirted was synthetic nicotine was utilized in these disposable vapes specifically. Loopholes have been found this entire time. So 2016, all tobacco products with being able to be managed by the FDA. 2019 was the first big push, the first big use of this regulation from the FDA. There was an outright caveat in 2019 that said disposable vapes can still have flavoring. One of the first things was no flavoring in these products, except in disposable vapes. So that's why disposable vapes really became a thing. When there was pushback from that, disposable vapes transitioned to synthetic nicotine. And so there was a period of downtime where they were semi-legal simply because of synthetic nicotine in these devices more than anything else. And so then 2022 was when the last kind of loophole, until the next one comes, was closed. So FDA manages everything: manufacture, import, packaging, labeling, advertising, sales, distribution. Their big gun, what they're using is what's called a pre-market tobacco product applications. And so you have to apply to be able to import, package, advertise, sell these devices. They do that by enforcement and monetary fines as well. So these pre-market tobacco products, they put a deadline that said all of these have to come in. Everything needs a pre-market tobacco product before 2022 or 2020 in September. They received 6 million applications at that time, and they got another, I think, 17 million in 2023. There's a backlog. There is definitely a backlog, and that's where a lot of these things were still on the market. So we talked about Juul, probably the most famous vape for a good 3 years. The FDA worked through its application almost 2 years later. Probably one that should have been the first one because of its popularity. 2 years later, they finally managed to say, you know what? No, we're going to put a ban to it. They had already stopped with flavors, but the type of device was deemed not allowable. And so the main things that they're using really 4 criteria to say we're going to allow this on the market or not. So they want risks and benefits for users and non-users. They want those risks to be low, but they're aware that it is a tobacco product and there will be risks. So it's not a zero risk product. Would somebody who is currently smoking be more or less likely to stop smoking if a device were available? What are the production methods? Are there well-regulated production methods, well-regulated plans? And then the big key one is, would new users be more or less likely to begin smoking, both cigarettes and vaping products? So they don't want they don't want any of these products necessarily to overly push people into using them. So think about the disposable vapes, the flavors, the colors, the ability to be stealthy with these devices. Those are all things that have really been the big push. That's really where the ban has been, are these advertised, or would these be used by kids? and they deem any flavoring as a yes. So any flavoring is not going to meet this application. Nothing is going to be approved. And so these are the only things that are technically allowed to be sold by the FDA. 3 companies, several different devices, no flavoring, nothing like that. Again, where is the actual enforcement? That's kind of the big question. Why can we go into any gas station and buy these things? That's kind of the big question. Louisiana does have its own laws. So last year, Act 414 created what's called a vape directory. And so it's a list. It's, again, very similar to that PTMA, an opt-in progress. So all certified manufacturers, certified products need to go and be approved within the state of Louisiana. That list is up and running. It includes vapor products. It also includes alternative nicotine products, which the FDA list includes as well. So it doesn't have to be a vape to be on this list. There are more that's approved in the state of Louisiana than the federal government, and that's so to be on the Louisiana list. There's 4 criteria, and this is the big one. Almost every product in Louisiana that's on the market is on the market because of this first one, which is essentially you're still in limbo with the FDA. You haven't gotten a marketing denial order from the FDA yet. They're looking at your application. They haven't finished your application. And it has to have been sold before any of the criteria to make this. So you can't come in with a new device right now and say, feel free to market it. It has to be an older product. Any new product has to go to that PMTA before being evaluated. The 3 other criteria, again, they've received that positive go-ahead from the FDA. They've received a no marketing order, but it's held up in a court case, which has also happened for many of these that are being declined. Or the commissioner within Louisiana can make a judgment on it itself. It's been kind of stop and go within Louisiana because of court cases as well. March 18th, the most recent case was that it was able to start up again, and that everything had to meet the vape directory laws within the law 414. So how do we talk about our patients? This will be the last topic. It'll be the last minute or two. What do we talk about? What's a practical guide to vaping history? As very similar to our questions with smoking. So run with that. Any vaping history is better than no vaping history, most importantly. Ask with empathy. Young adults, they're reluctant. They may be reluctant to share this history. Knowing some of these terminologies, knowing what some of these devices are, seeing these devices and being able to use that in a non-judgmental manner and starting that question, that can help. Having a one-on-one discussion with the adolescent, having parent leave with a room. Again, another thing. Ask what they're vaping. Is it a vape product? Is it a vape pen? Is it disposable? Is it something that, is it THC? Is it nicotine based? Ask where they got it. Did they get it at a store? Is it something sold? Is it something marketed? Or did they get it online? And who knows from where? How are they vaping? What device are they using? How often do they vape? What is the frequency of vape? Frequency, are they doing it more than 5 times a day? That's kind of one of the big kind of breaking points in terms of usage. How long does it take to complete a product, complete a disposable vape, most importantly? So they may not say how often they do it, but if they're going through a vape that has 5,000 puffs a day once a month, that's a pretty significant amount. Ask about the nicotine concentration if they know about it as well. Again, a part of what are they vaping. And then ask about other inhaled products. If you're focusing on nicotine, ask about THC products specifically. These are all questions that can really help further ask about that. And not just vaping, but cigarette smoking as well. All questions that you can ask. And then resources for stopping. That's, again, another important aspect. It is hard. We don't know what teenagers need for vapes. Is it different than smoking? Probably so. We need conceptual framework. We need delivery modality. So there are 2 text-based programs that have actually been proven to be good. With the This Is Quitting, which is done by the Truth Initiative. Smoke Free is a part of federal government, Health and Human Services. Odds ratio 1.39, higher cessation compared to not using this text group, not using this texting program. So they're daily texts, they support you. You can reach out to them at any point. You know, you can shoot a one-word text to them and they'll shoot a message back to try and encourage you if needed. If you need a little bit extra support, if you think you want to go vape and you need that support, all of those things can be done through texting. And like I said, at least one of these two, which they look very similar, has been proven to be better than nothing. Website smokefree.gov has an app as well as ability to build a plan and some information about building a plan that patients can use. And then 1-800-QUIT-NOW links you to counselors who are specifically trained to help with that. Another really important tool that we have that patients can use. And I think that's it. So I'll go ahead, I'll finish up, open the floor to questions.
All right, if you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them at this point. In order to get your credit for this, you will have to take the evaluation. It's available here through the QR code, and I will also email you momentarily with that link. Additionally, we have, if no one has any questions at the moment, you're welcome to unmute and ask your question at any time, but I'll go ahead and give my few announcements as you think on that. Our next Pediatric Gumbeaux webinar will be April 25th with Dr. Dan Fighton and Rebecca Schad at Office Practicum. And they will be talking about the website content on your pediatric practice website and how to have an effective website presence. This will be through the same link that you got here on pediatricgumbeaux.eventbrite.com. Our next conference will be August 16th through 18th in Alexandria. The agenda is posted on our website now, and we're excited to share that Dr. Sue Presley, the AAP president-elect, will be joining us as a speaker. You can also find our on-demand education on our education page at the LA AAP website or on YouTube. The link is in the chat, and those are available for credit. So if you missed any previous Gumbeaux, those are available for credit. Okay, Dr. Swetland, we have one question. Yeah. Someone is working with a 17-year-old who admits to frequent THC use via vape. He thinks it's not a big deal. He purchases them at a smoke shop that doesn't require an ID to prove age. Any suggestions there?
That second half is definitely hard. I mean, definitely illegal for a smoke shop to be doing that with no ID with age requirements. But thinking about no big deal, I think is being honest with the discussion about that, and being honest with what we know, the different additives, the lung inflammation, the lung damage. It is hard to get people to quit if they are not wanting to quit. Enrolling in a text message program that is about supporting your decision to quit isn't the right answer for this kid. That's not going to kind of push them into quitting. It is tough. I think just really trying to have an open conversation about the negatives of vaping and inflammation, and that yeah, it's not a harmless thing, but really it's again, you have to want to quit to be able to quit. Try and get that smoke shop in trouble, right? The Louisiana ATF might be it, but yeah, I don't. That's tough.
All right, do we have any other questions? Looks like a few people had to go ahead and leave. If I don't see any other questions, one question about, are there any medications to prescribe to help?
That's tough. I really didn't focus on that. I actually don't know. I try to just focus on some tools that can help. I'm not really sure on that right now.
Okay. Well, one to look up and figure out.
I would say a lot of it. There is a lot of overlap with any sort of smoking cessation, cigarette smoking cessation with vaping smoking cessation. I think for the most part, the idea is that they're the similar underlying treatments can still be done. Is it the best? That's what we still need to try and figure out.
Okay. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you, Dr. Swetland. I have to head on to another meeting, or I would keep it open for Q&A as long as there were questions. But I will let you all go today, and I will send an email immediately after this with that link to the evaluation. Thank you so much.
Everyone have a good day.